The sound that morning was not of thunder, nor of words. It was the sound of a wooden gavel meeting silence. The judge's voice carried through the courtroom like a stone dropped into deep water. Slow, heavy, inevitable. Margaret Hale. My name. After all these years, it still trembled inside me. Not because I feared it, but because I had forgotten what it felt like to hear it spoken aloud without suspicion. Around me, benches creaked with restless whispers. People who once shared tea with me now sat with folded arms, waiting for the truth they believed they already knew. There was no hostility in their eyes, only the cold satisfaction of certainty. And that, perhaps, hurt more than hate. For years I had lived beneath that certainty. They said I was silent because I had something to hide. They said I avoided the truth because it would destroy what little was left of my dignity. But they never asked why I stayed quiet. They never imagined silence could be a form of courage. Today, that silence would finally speak, not with defiance, not with anger, but with truth. And truth, when it finally rises, doesn't shout. It breathes. The courtroom smelled of polished oak and rain-soaked wool. Through the high windows, the light came filtered and uncertain, like morning struggling to remember itself. My hands were clasped, not out of fear, but to keep them from shaking with the weight of memory. Daniel was there, my eldest. He stood near the back, tall, proud, his jaw tight with the kind of restraint men mistake for control. He had not met my eyes in weeks. I knew that if he did, something in him might break, and pride has its own courtroom, far harsher than this one. Nora, his wife, sat beside him, composed, observant, her gaze coldly polite. To her this was not tragedy, it was proof that silence had a cost, proof that grief had made me weak. Perhaps she was right. Grief does make you weak, but only until you realize weakness can outlast judgment. Claire and Emma, my daughters, sat together on the other side. Claire's hands were restless, folding and unfolding a handkerchief. Emma whispered a prayer I couldn't hear. In her young voice, I felt the trembling of faith tested by the world's indifference. Behind them, familiar faces blurred. Neighbors, friends, the congregation that once sent flowers when Robert died. Each of them held a piece of my story, distorted by time and whispers. And in front of them all, the judge waited for my answer. They said I had withheld something, a letter my husband wrote before his death, a letter that might have changed the course of a man's fate, perhaps even saved his reputation. But the letter was never about his reputation. It was about truth. And truth, when born in grief, is fragile, like a newborn that the world isn't ready to hold. I remember the day they came for me, the questions, the accusations, the polite disbelief wrapped in sympathy. "Mrs. Hale," they said, "it's best if you cooperate. People are beginning to talk." I wanted to tell them that people have always talked. They talked when I married Robert. Too young, too quickly. They talked when I refused to remarry after he died. They talked when Daniel turned distant, when Nora questioned my sanity, when I chose solitude over defense. Let them talk, I thought. Words lose their power when silence becomes sacred. But here, in this room, silence was no longer sacred. It was evidence. When the judge spoke again, his tone was not unkind. "Mrs. Hale, do you wish to make a statement before we proceed?" I stood slowly. The wooden floor creaked beneath me, echoing like an old confession. Every eye turned. Even the rain outside seemed to pause. "I waited," I said softly, "for the truth to speak. But truth has a strange way of waiting for us to be ready. For years I thought silence would protect what little goodness was left. But silence doesn't protect. It preserves. It keeps things as they were, untouched, unresolved." A murmur moved through the room, a sound between pity and curiosity. "I was not silent because I was guilty," I continued. "I was silent because I wanted to remember my husband as he was, not as the world decided he had been. I kept that letter not to hide it, but to keep it from being twisted into another weapon. The judge leaned forward. "Do you still have this letter?" I hesitated. The question was not a surprise, yet it felt heavier than expected. "Yes," I said, "but I no longer need it." The courtroom shifted. Even Daniel's head lifted. "What do you mean you no longer need it?" the judge asked. "Because truth doesn't live on paper," I said. "It lives in how we carry what was done to us and what we refuse to do in return." There was silence. Not the kind that judges endings, but the kind that begins something unnamed. The moment felt suspended, like breath held between the past and the possibility of forgiveness. And for the first time, I saw it. The faintest tremor in Daniel's expression. Doubt. Or maybe recognition. He had spent years believing my silence was a form of pride. But pride is loud. What I carried was quieter, the ache of wanting to protect what could no longer be saved. A flash of memory crossed my mind. Daniel at 16, standing in the doorway after his father's funeral. "You could have done something," he said. But I had done something. I had kept the truth safe until it could walk on its own. And now, perhaps, it finally could. Samuel Alden sat a few rows back, his face lined with age and quiet understanding. He was the only one who knew about the letter, the only one who never asked to read it. Sometimes faith is not in God alone. It's in the silence we choose to keep for others. Our eyes met. He nodded once, slow and solemn. That was enough. The judge spoke again, announcing a recess. The gavel fell, final, unhurried, and the room stirred with motion. But I didn't move. Because when the gavel struck, something inside me shifted too. It wasn't release, not yet. It was recognition. The world had named me again, and this time I had answered. Outside, the rain had eased. I stood beneath the courthouse archway, watching droplets slide down the stone columns like tears that refused to fall. Clara, my housekeeper, waited with an umbrella. She looked at me, not with sympathy, but with the unspoken language of women who understand what silence costs. "You shouldn't stand in the rain," she said. "I've stood in worse," I replied. She smiled faintly. "Did it go as you expected?" "No," I said, "but maybe it went as it needed to." She didn't ask more. Some truths aren't meant to be repeated aloud. They dissolve once spoken, leaving only peace behind. As we walked down the courthouse steps, I caught sight of Nora again. She was holding Daniel's arm, speaking quietly, her posture composed as ever. But there was something new in her gaze, not kindness, not guilt, just uncertainty. And uncertainty, for someone like Nora, was the first crack in the armor. That night, the house felt heavier than usual. The walls remembered. They always do. I walked through the hallway, past portraits framed in dust and forgiveness. The air smelled faintly of cedar and lavender, the scent Robert loved most. For years, I avoided lighting the candle in his study. Tonight, I did. The flame flickered, casting shadows across the letter that still lay in its drawer. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. But I touched the paper gently, as one might touch a relic, not for its content, but for what it once meant. The truth had waited long enough. Tomorrow, it would speak. And so, as I sat by the window, pen in hand, the words came. Not from defiance, but from quiet release. For years, I waited for silence to speak, and today, it did. That line would begin my letter, not to the court, nor to Daniel, but to whoever once believed that patience was weakness. Because silence, when rooted in love, is not the absence of courage. It's its deepest form. Outside, the rain stopped completely, and somewhere within the stillness, I heard my name again, not from a judge, not from memory, but from the part of me that had waited to be heard. "Margaret," it whispered, "not in judgment, in peace." The following morning, the world looked cleaner, as if the rain had rinsed away its judgment. But I knew better. Judgment doesn't wash off. It dries, leaving rings like watermarks where faith once rested. When I entered the courtroom again, the air was colder. Perhaps it wasn't the air at all, but the chill that comes when people believe they already know the ending. The gallery was more crowded. New faces joined the familiar ones, drawn not by justice, but by curiosity. Curiosity, after all, has always been more powerful than compassion. I could feel the weight of their whispers before hearing them. She kept a letter. She betrayed her husband's memory. She made herself the victim again. Rumors have their own heartbeat, and in that room it pulsed faster than mine. Daniel sat closer to the front this time, Nora beside him, spine straight, lips sealed, eyes calculating. She had always been the voice of reason in the family, but reason without empathy is its own form of cruelty. Claire and Emma had aged overnight. Their faces reflected the quiet agony of daughters torn between love and disbelief. Claire's hand brushed mine for a second before I took the stand. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Because love, when tested in public, becomes its own form of prayer. The prosecutor's questions came like raindrops, cold, rhythmic, relentless. "Mrs. Hale," he began, "is it true that you withheld correspondence from your late husband for more than 5 years?" "Yes." "Was that correspondence related to financial misconduct?" "No." "To moral misconduct?" "No." He paused, as if unsatisfied with simplicity. "And yet you kept it hidden. Why?" The question hung there like smoke. Why? The word that builds walls and breaks hearts in equal measure. I glanced toward Daniel, hoping, foolishly, that I might find understanding in his face. But his eyes were lowered, fixed on his hands, as if truth was something he could avoid by looking away. "I kept it," I said softly, "because grief is not a crime, and memory is not evidence." The prosecutor smiled faintly, not kindly. "With respect, Mrs. Hale, grief is not the issue here. Secrecy is." A murmur moved through the audience. The judge raised a hand for silence, but the damage was done. A woman near the back whispered something to her neighbor. Laughter followed. Quiet, quick, cutting. It was strange, the way humiliation travels. It doesn't march, it seeps. It fills the cracks in the floorboards, the pauses between questions, the breaths you try not to take too loudly. Nora stood suddenly. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Her voice sliced the air like glass. Daniel turned sharply to her. "Nora, sit down." But she didn't. "I was there," she said, "the night she burned the first letter." Gasps spread across the room like wind across wheat. She continued, voice calm but trembling with righteousness. "I saw her through the kitchen window. She stood over the fire and fed it pages. And she didn't even cry." The prosecutor smiled. "Is this true, Mrs. Hale?" "Yes," I said. "I burned it." "Why?" "Because not all truths are meant to survive on paper." He raised an eyebrow. "So you destroyed evidence?" I shook my head. "No, I destroyed pain. There's a difference." Laughter again. Not loud, just enough to echo. Humiliation is rarely theatrical. It's slow, methodical, patient. It strips you one layer at a time until all that's left is the tremor of your own breath. I stood there, letting them look, letting them misunderstand. Because sometimes dignity is not in the defense. It's in endurance. The session recessed for lunch, and I sat alone in the hallway. Through the windows, the courtyard shimmered in sunlight. For a moment, I watched a child chase pigeons, his laughter piercing the solemn stillness like grace itself. How strange, I thought, that joy can exist even where shame lingers. Samuel Alden approached quietly, leaning on his cane. "They're hungry for guilt, not truth," he said. "You know that." "I do." "Then why stand so still under their judgment?" "Because running would make it real." He nodded. "Robert once told me you had the patience of God." "I used to think that was praise," I replied. "Now I'm not so sure." He chuckled softly, but his eyes glistened. "Patience is only painful when it's mistaken for surrender." Then he slipped something into my hand. An envelope, worn, creased, untouched for years. "Found this in the old church records. I think it's time." My heart clenched. The handwriting was Robert's. When court resumed, the atmosphere had shifted. The letter, the one everyone had spoken of but never seen, now existed in the open. And with its existence came a collective hunger. The judge motioned. "Mrs. Hale, you may read it if you wish." I looked at the seal, unbroken all these years. My fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the recognition that once opened, this moment could never be undone. I turned to Samuel. He gave a small nod. Slowly, I opened it. The paper was brittle, yellowed by time. The ink had faded, but the words were intact, heavy, deliberate, written by a man facing his own reckoning. "To whoever finds this," it began, "know that silence was never her sin. It was my request." A rustle of shock moved through the room. I asked her to keep quiet, not to protect me, but to protect the family from what I feared would destroy them. If I have wronged her by asking that, let this letter be my confession. The words blurred for a moment as tears filled my eyes. "Margaret, if this ever reaches daylight, forgive me for burdening you with my cowardice. You carried my silence longer than any woman should have to. I pray that someday truth will speak your name kindly." I stopped reading. No one moved. Even the prosecutor's pen had fallen still. The silence that followed was unlike the one before. It wasn't judgment. It was revelation. And yet, even in that vindication, I felt no triumph. Because truth, when it finally arrives, doesn't erase the years it took to come. The judge cleared his throat softly. "Mrs. Hale, this changes much. You've endured considerable scrutiny." I bowed my head slightly. "Truth takes its time, Your Honor." He nodded. "And it seems it has finally arrived." But something in his tone held both respect and sorrow. The acknowledgement that justice, even when served, always comes late. Daniel stood. For a moment I thought he would leave. Instead, he walked toward me, each step weighted with the years between us. He stopped a few feet away. "I didn't know," he said. "I know," I whispered. "I'm sorry." The words cracked inside him, raw and unfinished. Not yet forgiveness, but the fragile start of it. I wanted to reach for his hand, but I didn't. Some distances must be crossed by the heart before they can be bridged by touch. After the session ended, the townspeople avoided my eyes as they passed. It wasn't shame, it was discomfort. They had come for a spectacle and received a mirror. Nora lingered behind. Her face was pale, her voice unsteady. "I didn't mean to—" "Yes, you did," I said, not unkindly. "But meaning doesn't always make us right." She blinked, uncertain whether I had forgiven her or condemned her. Perhaps it was both. As I left the courthouse, Samuel walked beside me. "You could have destroyed that letter," he said quietly. "I know. But you didn't. Because truth deserves daylight, even if it blinds us." He smiled. "You've always had a way of turning pain into poetry." "Maybe pain is poetry," I replied. "We just forget to read it." That evening I sat by the window again. The sky burned with the gold of fading judgment. Claire brought tea, her hands trembling with unspent emotion. "Mother," she whispered, "was it worth it? All those years of silence?" I looked at her. at the reflection of every woman who ever held a truth too dangerous to speak. "Yes," I said, "because silence taught me how to hear the voice of truth when it finally came." She nodded, tears falling soundlessly. Emma joined us, placing her small hand over mine. In the distance, the church bells rang, not in mourning, not in warning, but in release. And in that sound, I realized something I hadn't before. Humiliation doesn't destroy dignity. It refines it. It burns away everything false until only truth remains, naked, unadorned, free. Outside, the first stars appeared, fragile, hesitant, but unafraid. I watched them through the reflection of my own face on the glass. The woman who had entered that courtroom was gone. The one who remained was quieter and stronger. Tomorrow would bring its own questions. But tonight, silence no longer accused me. It accompanied me, like an old friend who had finally learned to speak. The day after the hearing, dawn arrived quietly, almost shy, as if uncertain whether it was welcome. The mist rolled low across the fields, softening every edge, blurring the scars the night had left behind. For the first time in years, I woke without dread. I moved through the house slowly, the way one walks through memory. The floorboards still creaked in familiar complaint, the clock still hesitated before each chime, and yet, everything felt lighter. Perhaps the weight had never been in the walls at all. Perhaps it had always been in me. On the kitchen table lay the letter, Robert's confession, now folded, sealed once more. The court had taken its copy. This one remained mine, not as proof, but as witness. I lit a candle beside it and watched the wax melt. Each drop seemed to echo a year, a slow surrender of all that had been held too long. The house breathed again. So did I. Later that morning, Daniel came. I heard the gate close and his footsteps pause by the door. For years, I could recognize that pause, the moment of hesitation before he chose silence over reconciliation. But this time, the silence felt different. It wasn't avoidance. It was respect. When I opened the door, he looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in certainty. "May I come in?" he asked. "You always could," I replied. He stepped inside, his eyes tracing the familiar room as if it had aged in his absence. The scent of tea and rain filled the air. He stood by the window, staring out at the garden Robert once tended. "I used to hate this house," he said. "After Father died, it felt like a museum. Every room whispered things I didn't want to hear." "And now?" I asked. He hesitated. "Now I realize it wasn't the house. It was me." The admission came out like a sigh. Years of misunderstanding condensed into a single breath. He turned toward me, the light from the window catching the fatigue in his face. "I judged you, Mother," he said. "I wanted someone to blame. It was easier than facing how little I understood him, or you." I didn't move. I wanted to hold him, but something in me knew this moment wasn't about comfort. It was about reckoning. "You were protecting us," he continued, "and I called it pride. I see that now." I met his eyes. "You see it because truth doesn't humiliate, Daniel. It humbles." He nodded, swallowing the weight of his own silence. For a moment, the world outside disappeared. It was just us, mother and son, standing on the fragile bridge built from pain and understanding. The days that followed unfolded like a slow thaw. The town grew quieter, not out of peace, but out of reflection. Gossip has a strange way of dying, not from exhaustion, but from revelation. When truth stands bare, rumor has nowhere left to hide. At the market, people who once crossed the street to avoid me now nodded in awkward greeting. A few even smiled, quick, apologetic smiles, as if shame could be disguised as civility. I accepted them all. Not because they deserved forgiveness, but because I needed freedom. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a gift to the other. It's the release of your own burden. Clara, ever practical, noticed the change before I did. "Your face looks different," she said one evening while folding laundry. "How so?" "Lighter, like you finally stopped carrying everyone's silence." I smiled. Maybe silence was never mine to carry. She nodded. "It never is. It just finds the ones strong enough to hold it." Her words stayed with me. One afternoon, a letter arrived. This time, not from the past, but from the judge himself. A personal note, not official, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "Mrs. Hale," it read, "your grace in truth has reminded me that justice is not in verdicts, but in the dignity of endurance. The court has its laws. You, however, have lived one." I read it twice, then folded it carefully. For years I thought truth needed witnesses. Now I understood. Sometimes it only needs endurance. Weeks passed. The season began to turn. The maple trees outside burned with gold, their leaves falling in soft surrender. Claire often visited, bringing warmth and laughter back into the house. Emma filled the evenings with music, simple hymns on the piano, her fingers trembling between faith and forgiveness. And Daniel, he came often too. Not to talk about the trial, but to sit, to listen, to exist beside me without defense. In that quiet, I saw the boy he once was, the boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and unspoken fears. Time had taken much, but not that boy entirely. One evening he asked the question I had long awaited. "Do you hate Father for what he did?" I thought for a moment before answering. "No. He carried his fear the way I carried my silence. We both thought we were protecting love." He looked down, his voice low. "Then why does it still hurt?" "Because truth doesn't heal by erasing pain," I said softly. "It heals by making it mean something." He closed his eyes. A tear slid down his cheek, the first I had seen since he was a child. I reached out, touching his hand gently. "Let it hurt," I whispered. "It's how the wound knows it's closing." A month later, the town held a small gathering at the church, not to celebrate me, but to commemorate Robert's memory. For the first time, I agreed to attend. The pews were filled with the same faces that had once judged me. The air smelled of polished wood and lilies. Reverend Whitmore spoke with measured grace, his words a blend of scripture and silence. When he invited me to speak, I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of awe. How strange it felt to be seen again. I walked to the front slowly, my steps echoing on the stone floor. Every sound in that room had weight. "I don't stand here to defend the past," I began. "The past does not need defense. It needs understanding. My husband, Robert, was not a perfect man, but he was an honest one, even in his failure. And perhaps that is what honesty truly is, not the absence of mistakes, but the courage to face them." The room was still. Even Nora, seated near the back, bowed her head. For years, I believed silence was my punishment. Now I see it was my teacher. It taught me that truth does not shout to be believed. It waits, patiently, until hearts are quiet enough to hear it. I paused, looking at the faces before me. We have all judged. We have all been wrong. But judgment ends where compassion begins. And forgiveness, real forgiveness, is not earned. It is given freely because the soul cannot breathe without it. The Reverend's eyes glistened. He nodded gently, as if blessing not just my words, but the years that shaped them. When I stepped down, the church bell rang. One long note, soft and resonant. It was not a funeral bell. It was release. That night back home, I sat at my desk and began to write again. Not to the court, not to Robert, but to myself. "The truth did not save me," I wrote. "It revealed who I had been all along." The candle flickered beside me, its light trembling like breath. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, carrying the faint echo of the bell. The house was still, but not silent. There was a hum now, the sound of peace settling where pain once lived. I thought of every woman who had ever been silenced, every soul that waited for the world to listen. I wished I could tell them, "You are not forgotten. The voice you buried inside you is not gone. It's waiting, patient as dawn." As I closed my journal, I saw my reflection in the window, not the widow they once pitied, but a woman reborn through truth. I smiled. For years I had lived as if silence were a sentence. Now I knew. It had been a sanctuary. Outside, morning began to rise again. And somewhere between the fading stars and the first light, I heard it, faint but unmistakable, the echo of my name. Margaret Hale. No longer an accusation, now a benediction. The same name that once condemned her is now spoken in peace. The same silence that once hid her now shelters her truth. Because justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't punish, it restores. And when truth finds its voice, even the quietest soul becomes eternal. Would you have spoken, or waited for silence to speak for you? Tell me below. My name is Margaret Hale, and what you're about to hear are the echoes of a life divided between love, loss, and truth. If my story touched you, stay close. Subscribe and walk with me through every chapter.